Then I think actually that we can start. I'm very pleased to see such a great turnout for this seminar. I know it's been announced in a very short notice for a number of reasons, and we had our communication problems. To see to see this great turnout is very heartening and stimulating. It really shows how both the excellence of the panel and also I think the importance of the topic. So with those words, I would like to invite or to welcome you to this seminar on the Al-Shabaab and Kenya's Somalia invasion, the security, development, and humanitarian intervention in East Africa. I should perhaps first say that this is a kind of a part of a series of seminars that we are having here at PRIO this week on issues having to do with the Horn of Africa, with conflict issues. We're going to have a debate tomorrow evening at Litteraturhuset with David Anderson and William Reno and Liv Tørres from Norwegian People's Aid to discuss the Horn of Africa more generally. And we're going to have a seminar on Friday on warfare in independent Africa with Professor William Reno. Today we're going to focus on Somalia and Kenya, and I'm very happy to welcome Dave Anderson, first and foremost. Professor of African politics at Oxford University and a well-known specialist and authority on all things East African and Horn of Africa, I think we can say. We are having two discussants. And I was also going to mention that David Anderson is working on a number of projects. He has a long range of publications on these issues, but one of the projects he's working on now is a historical ethnography of Little Mogadishu in Nairobi, together with Professor Ned Currier. So that's Neil Currier, sorry. So that's Dave Anderson. Then we have Kjetil Tronvoll, who's a senior partner at the International Law and Policy Institute of Oslo, but has a long track record working on both Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa in general, as well as an emerging authority on Zanzibar, perhaps even an established one, you would say. Then finally, our own Cindy Horst, senior researcher at PRIO, specialist on Somalia and on forced migration issues, and specifically on the Dadaab Somali refugee camp in northern Kenya. So I think this is one of the best panels that is possible to put together for this topic almost anywhere, at least in Norway, but probably also other places. So it is a great pleasure to have these people here to discuss and to present. So what we're going to do today is that David is going to give his presentation first. Then there will be comments from Kjetil and from Cindy, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. And that's the general way it goes. And we will do our utmost to finish on time and encourage people to ask people at the other questions afterwards when the seminar is finished. And with those words, I give the word to David.
Okay, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be in Oslo. I flew here yesterday from Washington, where I was talking to the State Department about these issues. And I've been talking in the last 2 months to a number of governments, and especially military-related and conflict-related groups, about the Kenyan invasion. It is very shocking to me when doing that they understand so little about the refugee and humanitarian aspects of this war, and that so little attention is given to those issues. and I hope to come back to that in what I have to say this afternoon. Thank you very much for tolerating me presenting in English. I can assure you, if you came to Oxford, we wouldn't want you to present in Norwegian, so I appreciate warmly being able to do so. I should explain perhaps that I'm a historian by training, not a political scientist, and I think that will become apparent in some of the ways that I analyze the material. But I have a chair of politics, so I have to pretend to be a political scientist, so I'm doing my best. I should also say I'm not an expert in refugee or migration studies. We have one here on the panel, very fortunately, who can keep us all right. But I do want to emphasize the importance in this context of Kenya's invasion of Somalia of linking up the refugee and humanitarian issues to the geopolitics and the conflict issues. And the more we can all do to make that happen, the better. So let me begin. October 16th, 2011, Kenya's armed forces invaded southern Somalia, seemingly without any advance notice to anyone. They did so in the midst of a regional famine. Not just any famine, but the worst famine this region has seen for nearly 30 years. Why they chose to do so at that time, and what their purpose was, are things open to debate and discussion. The Kenyans, as much as they announced anything, said that they were aiming to obliterate the Shabaab Islamist militia from southern Somalia, and that they aimed to take the town of Kismayu on the southern Somalia coast as a way of strangling Al-Shabaab's economic base. They initially announced they would manage to do this within a matter of days. 3 months on, their army is still bogged down, stuck around the town of Afmado. I'll show you a map in a moment to illustrate some of this. And they are not really making great progress. They found that Al-Shabaab's resistance is much, much stronger than they imagined. They have found that they don't themselves have the technical capacity they thought they had to carry out the task. And I think they're a little disappointed that none of their Western allies have come immediately to their assistance. Because I think part of the calculation was that Kenya's friends abroad couldn't afford to let them fail. So this was a kind of calculated gamble. What I want to do in explaining this is to go through various aspects of that invasion and to contextualize it. And I'm going to start with that famine and the refugee problem that it created. The area along the Kenyan-Somali border has been a refugee crisis now for at least 20 years. There have been UNHCR-controlled camps for refugees along that border between the town of Garissa and the border since the early 1990s. I myself first visited those camps in 1998. I've most recently been back about 6 years ago to the camps themselves. So acute is the refugee situation in that area now that the town of Garissa itself has almost become like a refugee camp, surrounded by informal settlements of illegal or irregular refugees who've managed to escape the camp system and simply settled near the town. The figures for the populations of these camps are really quite mind-boggling. And for those in the audience who are not familiar with it, I want to go through this because I think it just helps to get the scale. These graphs illustrate the rising population of Dadaab camp over a nearly 10-year period, from 136,000 refugees in 2002 to 2010, when there were nearly 300,000. That's at the end of 2010. The most reliable figures I could get for December 2011 now place that figure at 475,000 people. This makes Dadaab one of the largest conurbations in Eastern Africa. This is a refugee settlement with no formal utility services of water or power. Yet it is a huge city that needs to be fed and sheltered every day. When the Kenyan government says this is a drain on their resources, they're absolutely right. How did it come to be that UNHCR let this happen? The Dadaab camps were set up to house no more than 80 to 90,000 people initially. They now hold 5 times that number, and that situation has gone on for many, many years with a steady rise in the numbers. Over that time, the Kenyan government has constantly bickered with UNHCR about the camps. The Kenyan military and security forces have for a long time, 10 years at least, wanted the camps moved back to the Somali side of the border because they believed that would ease their security problems. It might not do so, but that's their argument. Within Kenya itself, the camps have become enormously unpopular because the public imagine that these camps are destroying the environment and destroying the economy, and that Kenya is in some way paying for them. Now that may not be factually true, because actually it's an international community that is paying for the bulk of things in these camps. But that does not negate the fact that the Kenyans are quite right to ask questions about how this has been allowed to happen in this way. Why were not these camps controlled? Why were they not relocated? Why have the numbers got so large? Why has there been no response from the international community to dealing with the camps and their location? Now I emphasize that because one of the main reasons for the Kenyan invasion of southern Somalia is these camps, which the military in Kenya argue are a security threat that's getting worse, because the camps, they say, are being infiltrated by Islamist fundamentalists who are radicalizing the population of the camps. Now, it's very difficult to evaluate such claims and accusations. We do know that arms and weapons have been found in the Dadaab camps and also in similar camps that lie on the Ethiopian border with Somalia, north of Mandera. We do know also that these camps have been the source of local banditry, of criminality. Why wouldn't they be when you have population of this size? On the Ethiopian side, there's around 200,000 in the Ethiopian camps. So you have a total refugee population that's in camps along this border of around 750,000 people. Of course it's going to generate a local conflict economy, and that's exactly what it does. But the camps have become homes to these people. I've seen some writing that describes Dadaab as a prison rather than a camp. A prison for families and generations. There are many, many, many children in Dadaab, or not children anymore, people in their late teens, who were born there and who've never lived anywhere else, and whose status traps them in the camp. They can't obtain documentation to leave it. They have no legal status in Kenya beyond the camp. Since the invasion of southern Somalia on the 16th of October, the camp has effectively been locked down by the military so that people cannot easily get in and out. Previously there was a very lively black economy from the camp, and there were flows and movements in and out, and especially to Nairobi's easterly location. With the conflict, that's all been ended, so the situation in the camps is really quite severe. The invasion also coincided with the rains coming back to this part of East Africa, which in one sense was a good news story. But those who know this area well will realize that rain is not necessarily a solution immediately, because rain brings with it flooding and waterborne diseases. And by the middle of November, there was cholera in Dadaab and also in the Ethiopian camps. That cholera claimed at least 70 lives in the Ethiopian camps in November. I haven't yet had time to look for the figures for Dadaab, but they'll be on the UNHCR site, I'm sure. And the sense I got last week from talking to UNHCR staff is that Dadaab was teetering on the verge of an epidemic. They're trying to control it, but they're not sure which way it's going to go. Because the lockdown in the camps is making it difficult to get supplies in and out of the area, and the military are obstructing the movement of supplies because they're searching everything for alleged terrorist activity. So the war is fundamentally making the refugee situation worse and more difficult to manage. This graph, you won't be able to read it very clearly from the back, but it just to illustrate the fact that the camps I'm referring to along the Kenyan border here and the Ethiopian border here are just part of the problem. There are other Somali refugees in Yemen, where camps now house nearly 200,000 people, and in Djibouti, where the figure is around 20,000 at the moment. Overall, these refugees are just one aspect of the Somali diaspora in the region. In Kenya as a whole, there are 2.4 million Somalis, only around 700,000 of which have legal status. So beyond those and the camps, which adds up to about 1.2 million, there is the same number again illegally resident throughout Kenya. And that's from the recent Kenyan census. In Ethiopia, it's more difficult to get an overall figure, even though Ethiopia did a census in 2007. But by looking at that census in some detail, you can look at the Somali province, which is the Ogaden region here, and just take that as an indicator. In the Ogaden region, 97% of the population of that region are Somali speaking. And that amounts to around 4 million people, approximately. In Yemen, we don't have census data, but it's reckoned that there's probably around 500,000 to 750,000 Somalis in Yemen in total. And they're concentrated in the southern area around Aden and along these ports, along the shore. There is an industry in smuggling people across from the North Somali coast to Yemen. People pay to go and get themselves into Yemen. Why anyone should pay to go to Yemen, I'm not quite sure, but that maybe tells you something about conditions in Somalia. But this is a serious issue, and the camps in Yemen are also a focus of security concerns because many arms and weapons have been found in those camps. It's not surprising because in Yemen, Yemen has the highest per capita rate of small arms of any place in the world. The joke in Yemen is that Kalashnikovs are known as Alis, because every family has one. And certainly it's not surprising to find weapons in the refugee camps in Yemen. So this is part of a broader regional problem. And there's the figures overall for recognized, acknowledged, registered refugees in each country. So that's the official population. And what I'm saying is the real population is in each case several times larger than that official population. This is a diagram that might be familiar to some of you from the UNHCR website, which is their attempt from survey work to calculate when refugees are coming into the camps and from where they're coming and what the cause is. Now, I don't place much value in this survey data in absolute terms, but I would draw attention to one aspect of this which is quite illuminating, which is this section here, which is reasons for displacement. And what this shows is a timeline from September 2011 to November 2011. And what we see is that the second column is drought as the reason for you coming. And as you can see, once the rains start, that immediately falls away to almost nothing. But it's replaced by a peak in insecurity and conflict. And I think that relationship very clearly shows that the invasion immediately promoted and provoked a reaction, and that the bulk of refugees coming to those camps after the invasion were coming for security issues. I would also point out that November 2011 saw the highest number of refugees ever in 1 month into Dadaab. It was 5,700 came in that 1 month alone. And that's the highest number since we've been keeping records of the camps. There's Dadaab. Photograph taken, I think we took that around, it's up on Flickr now. That was taken, I think, around 2009, something like that. Again, during the rainy season, so you can see water around. But the sheer scale of Dadaab is difficult to get your head around. And here are some images from the camps. That one was taken fairly recently with the rains in the camp. You can see what I mean by flooding. When the rains come, stagnant water all over this area, and that's what causes the health problems. And there's Hudur Hospital to the north in Bakul. That's not the camp, that's an area to the north. And there's the Hudur airfield from 2006 during the rains. And I'm told it recently looked just like that again. And the reason for putting that up is that's the airfield to which it is alleged the Eritreans are flying in arms for Al-Shabaab. Well, they sure aren't flying them in these conditions. And that may be one reason why the Kenyans, although there were disadvantages to invading when the rains came, there were other advantages to the report. Al-Shabaab can't supply itself nearly as easily in the rains. So this map shows the invasion from the Kenyans, one battalion from Liboy, a second from Ras Kamboni, and a third, much less well publicized, from El Wak. Now, most of the journalists mistakenly think the Kenyans are going this way, to Afmado and then down to Kismayu. What they're in fact trying to do is to take Afmado, which is on the river Juba, and seal off that crossing, and then move to Jalib. And Jalib's on the river Shebele and on the road to Mogadishu. So what they're attempting to do is encircle and cut off Kismayu, and then move in on the city. So they've not been going directly to Kismayu. They'll save that until they cross off. They've not yet got much beyond Afmada, because Al-Shabaab basically dug in, defended very well. They have battlements built at Jabil, they have tunnels at Jabil, they have a whole complex at Jabil. So it's going to be a difficult campaign, but that's what they're trying to do. The Ethiopians, in the meantime, a few weeks into this, although they didn't at the time consult directly with the Kenyans, also invaded. And they came in here, and they headed down to Baidoa. Now this was in fact just the admission of a long-standing Ethiopian policy, whereby in Bakul and in Gedo, northern Gedo, they have been funding militia groups who are opposed to Al-Shabaab. They've been doing so covertly. And those militia groups have been trying to hold the whole area here to prevent Shabaab pushing up to the north and to the Ogaden border. So the Ethiopians' attempt is to split links between the Ogaden and Al-Shabaab, so that the Al-Shabaab forces don't support the ONLF forces and other forces in the Ethiopian area. That appears to have been fairly successful. There's now at least 2 Ethiopian battalions at Baidoa, and if they haven't taken it already, I think they probably will take the town fairly soon. And what that does is that basically it strangles Al-Shabaab into an area south of where my pointer is. And that's the aim, to stop them getting back north if the Kenyans and their allies eventually push them out. So that's the military objectives. What about the political side of this? Well, that's a picture showing some of the Somali leaders with Kenya's foreign minister, all smiles and bonhomie. But this was taken some 3 or 4 days after the invasion began. Because when it began, it appeared that some of the gentlemen in this photograph didn't know it was beginning. From the best information we can gather, the invasion was not discussed by the Kenyan cabinet. The decision was taken by a small coterie around the president and the military. And the military had a very loud voice, I believe, in what happened. And for those of you who know about Kenya, that's quite a worrying development, because until fairly recently the Kenyan military has not been particularly overt in politics. And I think what this invasion partly should warn us against is that Kenya's military now has a strong voice in politics, and that might prove quite decisive as we move ahead. From the Somali side, these gentlemen represent the TFG, the Transitional Federal Government in Mogadishu, many of whom actually live and reside in Nairobi. Now that government has been very ineffective over the years and hasn't really achieved much it was intended to achieve. But the strategy of the regional group IGAD, which is the East African Federation of countries, it's the equivalent of ECOWAS and SADC, the approach of IGAD has been to try and argue against a multiple Somali solution. IGAD doesn't want there to be 5 Somalias all applying to join, all as Islamist states. which is their nightmare scenario. They want one Somalia, one voice, one vote only. So they are doing their level best to try and prevent a multiple Somaliland solution. So if you've been wondering why the international community is slow to acknowledge the existence of Somaliland in the north, the real reason is that the regional states will not support it. And international countries in Europe and in North America will not, they feel too exposed to acknowledge Somaliland, while those in the region will not. So one can see the invasion of southern Somaliland partly as an IGAD initiative. And in fact, if one looks back over the reporting of IGAD presidents' meetings, of some of the papers available to us thanks to WikiLeaks, you can get quite a clear picture that IGAD has been discussing this problem in depth for the last 2 years, and that the invasion was not a spontaneous act just by the Kenyans. It was well planned and well organized. The Kenyans have been being trained by the Americans since 2009. They recruited a Somali-speaking battalion of 2,500 men from within Kenya, who they trained as Ranger-style forces. And the idea was an old-fashioned American tactic that's been used elsewhere, which would be to put a third force, an infiltration force, into southern Somalia to work with local militias to destabilize al-Shabaab. So the Kenyans had trained men already who were in southern Somalia before the invasion, one group at Ras Kamboni, the other group in the central area, who were working with rebel militias against al-Shabaab. And the Americans have been training for that, the British have been involved in it as well. It's been quite a well-known tactic. The Kenyans have even gone so far as to suggest that this part of southern Somaliland, Somalia rather, known as Jubaland, ought to have its independence, in inverted commas. And they've even suggested that a constitution should be drafted for its government, and that one of their militia heads should be the leader of that government. He happens to be a French anthropologist who is known by the name of Gandhi. Confusing, but that's the situation. So you can see that Kenyans have done a lot of thinking about what this might look like. Now, I do not believe that that's been done unilaterally. And I know there have been back-channel discussions between the Kenyans and the Ethiopians about what the future of this area should be. Now, that doesn't mean the Kenyans and the Ethiopians agree. They do not. They have some very divergent ideas about what the future should look like. But both have a vested interest in recreating a weak Somalia that they can control. And that, I think, is their principal aim. They don't want a strong Somalia on their border with an army that looks threatening. They want a federated Somalia of little weak parts, some of which on the borders they control and manipulate. Now, I'll leave it to the discussion for us to ask whether that's in the interests of Somalia and whether Somalis will like that or not. I suspect I know the answer, but let's come to that in the discussion. So I think that the point I'm trying to get across is I don't think we should see this invasion as a spontaneous act. It's part of a program of activities. And if you think about it that way, you can see that the famine and the refugee crisis presented an opportunity. And the excuse for that opportunity was the apparent seizure of hostages, allegedly by al-Shabaab. If you remember, 2 British tourists were captured and 1 shot in September. A French tourist was taken, and 2 Spanish workers for MSF were kidnapped from Dadaab camp. Now, there's actually, I've seen a little bit of evidence now that at least 1 set of those hostages got traded on to an al-Shabaab militia later. But there is no direct evidence that al-Shabaab took any of those hostages. And indeed, al-Shabaab made statements denying involvement in these events from the start. And al-Shabaab had good reasons not to take hostages, because it gets its revenue flows from other areas, and it doesn't want to be entangled with the piracy issue. But of course, as al-Shabaab has become under more pressure and is more pressurized, involvement with that kind of activity becomes more likely. But back in September, I don't think al-Shabaab did these things, but every announcement by the Kenyan government said that they did. And when Kenyan government officials were asked repeatedly to give the evidence, they said they couldn't. There was none. But the fact that al-Shabaab was alleged to have done these things justified the invasion. It was a very useful excuse. And the military spokespersons repeated this again and again. This is the Kenyan Chief of Staff and his main advisors. And here is the wonderful Manuel Chirchir, who is the Kenyan spokesperson. He's the guy who tweeted the 10 towns they were about to invade, causing a massive exodus of people. How stupid can you get? And here's that slightly more sinister photograph. Managed to get hold of this one from various sources. These are the American Rangers who've been training the Kenyan forces for the last 2 years at Isiolo, and also sometimes using the camp down in Manyani and on the British facility up at Archer's Post, which is now Britain's largest and most important overseas training base. I wonder why Britain wants to keep this stable. And there's the Kenyan Navy. Because behind this whole story is the piracy question. Lots of European governments are interested in this situation because they feel that the instability of Somalia generally, its statelessness, is the cause of the piracy problem. Therefore, they make a connection between getting rid of Al-Shabaab, taking the port of Kismayu, and that will help to solve the piracy problem. It will not. The two things are not necessarily related. They might have some links, but there's no cause and effect. Al-Shabaab are not pirates. Pirates are not Al-Shabaab. But it's very alarming when I go around talking to policy people that that is not understood. There is an assumption that this will solve the piracy problem. It will not. It's driven by different things. Also, that assumption is based on the idea that if the Kenyans get control of Kismayu, everything will be just fine. I beg to differ. The Kenyans and the Ethiopians disagree enormously on how Kismayu should be governed and administered. Kismayu is an extremely difficult place to defend, and the Kenyans will find it very costly in terms of body bags. B, it's a very divided area. It's not obvious which clan and which group should run Kismayu. Unless they make a very careful allocation of resources around Kismayu, everybody will be sniping at them. The Kenyan army want to be rehatted in Kismayu as a peacekeeping force as part of AMISOM. Now, raises, and I'm going to finish in this in the last couple of points, but this raises some other difficulties. Some of you may know that AMISOM was set up as a peacekeeping movement supported by the AU under a United Nations statute to go in to Mogadishu to hold the peace. Well, last summer, Museveni, whose Ugandan forces formed the major part of AMISOM, basically threw away that agreement and turned AMISOM into a counterinsurgency campaign. Now that should worry us for several reasons. Firstly, AMISOM is paid for by us, by the West. These African armies cannot fund it themselves. Part of the reason why they get involved is to be paid by us to do it. We paid for a peacekeeping mission. We now have a counterinsurgency war that we are effectively funding. Now that may be a good thing in the sense that the outcome might be a positive one for Somalia. Al-Shabaab being pushed out of Mogadishu is certainly a positive outcome. I wouldn't argue with that at all. But the way in which this peacekeeping mission has morphed into a counterinsurgency campaign is really quite troubling for the status of international law. The Kenyans are now arguing that they should be rehatted as part of that peacekeeping mission. So we pay for their invasion too. It's costing them around $180 million a month. Even Kenya can't afford that. So they need to be rehatted to get someone else to pay for the cost of the munition. Now, if the Kenyans were rehatted and put in charge of Kismayu, that wouldn't be the end of the problem. Because the Kenyan army has no real supply and logistics, so it predates off the land. So as soon as the Kenyans are situated in Kismayu, they will need to be supplied. And that will affect the entire local economy, and there'll be trouble. And if you want a parallel, just think of what happened when the Ugandans and Rwandans went into Eastern Congo. The same kind of situation, where they will have to create local militias in order to survive themselves in the situation they're in, because they'll need to protect their procurement. So I think the taking of Kismayu is only the beginning of another kind of problem. And then to conclude, last comment. What about those refugees that we started with? Where do they end up out of all this? What's their situation going to be? Well, probably no different and probably quite a lot worse. Because the militarization of the whole border zone has made the administration of those refugee camps much worse. The idea that refugee flows will be stopped by the invasion is demonstrably false. We can show by the figures of the last few months that the invasion has in fact generated more movement, not less, despite the fact the famine is easing, not getting worse. So the invasion itself is becoming a cause of humanitarian crisis. Will southern Somalia under Kenyan rule be any more stable and any more likely to deliver aid to these people? I'm not sure. I'd need some convincing. But if that is not the outcome, the status of ordinary people and of refugees in this area is certainly going to be no better, and I think I would argue it will be a good deal worse. I don't think the militarization of the area by the Kenyans is going to help. Will the Kenyans actually get rid of Al-Shabaab? No. Al-Shabaab will not be got rid of. It will disappear and re-emerge somewhere else. And eventually, some kind of settlement has to be made with the groups that make up Al-Shabaab. Now, I agree with the analysts who say that the current leadership of Al-Shabaab is difficult to talk to for all kinds of good reasons. But Al-Shabaab is made up of a coalition of many smaller parts. And I think the stripping off of those smaller parts and discussions with them should be a diplomatic tactic that is being employed. And as Al-Shabaab comes under more pressure, that may be possible, and we may find we can reduce its size and its scope. But my best guess is that Al-Shabaab will re-emerge after the Kenyan invasion along the Shabelle Valley or in central Bakul, somewhere else as a different kind of problem. So diplomatically, we shouldn't imagine we can simply crush it. We have to talk to it. We have to deal with it. Now what about these guys, the Kenyan and Ethiopian military? Well, they've had a good year. They've done well out of this. Lots of practice for what they do best, lots of extra training, lots of international support. Their position in regional politics has been strengthened. And I think that's one of the worrying things for this region. Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, they are all post-liberation military governments. They are not democracies. They are autocracies. And they are led by military men who don't balk at military solutions. Has Kenya just moved a step closer to joining that club? I hope not, but I'm worried that maybe it has. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was very impressive performance, actually. It's not that often that you can get this kind of live update on such a military project in such a difficult area to work. So and now it's going to be very interesting to listen to Kjetil's comments and afterwards Cindy's. So it's, do you want to have the microphone? This one?
No, I'll sit here. It's okay? You can hear me? Great. Yes, thanks a lot. And Øystein, thanks for inviting me to join you in such an interesting and topical debate. And David is surely presenting, really, what can I say, solid, sound, empirical data and information on what's happening on the ground today. And it's unfolding as we speak, I think. On my way here, in my car, I heard the news about the raid last night. Yes. Yeah, with the release of the hostages. So this is really, really topical, what we're discussing. And you present a very admirable overview of the military intervention and the phases and the complexities that has created on the ground in southern Somalia. And it's not so much for me to add to that, you know that far better than I do. But in addition to what you present as the military scenario, I think we can, at least I would like to highlight three major issues, three major concerns springing out from David's talk. One more practically oriented, one more theoretically, scholarly oriented, and one politically motivated. The first is what we can see the Somalia case is best an example of is the repoliticization, the militarization, and the shrinking of the humanitarian space in contested areas, and what that will involve in terms of international assistance and work in these areas. The second is what we see here, and its implications on how to understand African statehood, African territorial claims, and ultimately sovereignty in Africa, how that is manifested. And thirdly then, it's the implications on the regional power dynamics in the Horn of Africa, and in particular, Kenyan-Ethiopian relations. How will they emerge after this scenario, considering a lot of other factors contributing to contributing to possibly destabilizing Ethiopian-Kenyan relations. That will be very interesting to hear your reflections upon. First then, the humanitarian space. Since 9/11, the world has witnessed a radical shrinking of what we term the humanitarian space, areas in humanitarian crisis zones where we can work to alleviate the humanitarian crisis, try to address it, and try to move out of it. States and other authorities are redefining access to this area, to this space, and inter alia putting restrictions upon direct humanitarian assistance, but also data gathering or peace negotiations or movement out of the situation. And a military solution to the Somalia humanitarian crisis, as Kenya has argued was the motivation for their intervention, is probably going to aggravate the humanitarian situation on the ground than lessen it, as David pointed out. On top of this militarized context, we see a new set of anti-terror legislation provided by the governments in the region, but also kind of international anti-terror legislation, which are criminalizing contact with key actors in the field. In this case, Al-Shabaab. Any kind of relations with Al-Shabaab, which can be construed as assistance, and that can most kind of relations be, are directly criminalized by Ethiopia, by Kenya, also by Norway, and in particular by the US new anti-terror legislation too. So it is actually extremely hazardous and extremely dangerous for anyone to be in direct relations and contact with Al-Shabaab actors, which then, to get a solution to the problem on the ground, you need to be one way or another. And in particular, of course, this is a concern harbored by the international NGOs working in this area, but also as the recent judgment in Ethiopia against 2 Swedish journalists who were accompanying the Ogaden National Liberation Front into Ogaden, the neighboring area of what David has talked about here, were sentenced then to 11 years imprisonment just before Christmas because of aiding terrorist activities. And these were journalists just trying to cover their job, doing their job, in finding out what was happening on the ground in this area. This could just as well have been scholars, researchers, doing research on ONLF or on Al-Shabaab, being sentenced to 12 or longer terms imprisonment in Ethiopia, doing their master's thesis or PhD thesis or doing ordinary research work. That's a dangerous scenario we see ahead of us. And also, actually, even Norwegian law can be construed in that manner. If you do your thesis on Al-Shabaab, you better be careful. You might end up in jail in Norway too. So very, very scary scenarios on what's happening within the humanitarian space. And I believe maybe you will continue on that. So I will leave that as an interesting aspect of a paper. The second one, a more theoretical notion of it, is of course how this reflects what's going on in terms of African statehood, territory, and sovereignty. The lack of the central government in Somalia has left kind of the Somali territory up for grabs both by clan political alliances within the old Somali territory, and notably Somaliland, Puntland, so on can be representatives of that, and also from neighboring states with nationalistic ambitions, be that Ethiopia, Kenya, Eritrea, possibly Uganda, for that matter. Horn of Africa is surely the geographical region in the world where we clearly see that state formation and territorial reshaping are very much alive and ongoing. From an empirical viewpoint, the territorial borders of existing and emerging states in the Horn are constantly challenged and renegotiated. And the best example of that might be the 1998-2000 war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which some considered to be the first classical, conventional territorial border war on African soil, where two huge, well-organized, disciplined state armies went into battle to fight it out, the biggest conventional and battles on African soil since the Second World War. I have argued elsewhere that it was different reasons to the outbreak of that war than only territorial claims, but surely that's still the key factor, and that war is still not solved, as we know. Territory and sovereignty in the ancient Somalia, if you can call it that, the old Somalia territory, is clearly contested by the breakout states of Somaliland and Puntland. However, we also now see then the territory of the old Italian Somaliland are seemingly contested by Kenya and Ethiopia too. They have their specific agenda, as David has outlined, at least the Kenyan one we have learned a lot about. And Ethiopia has its own too, and how this will shape the territory on the ground, if it will be a loose federal model, as you hinted at, if it will be breakout states. A lot of actors are pushing for the recognition of Somaliland first, international actors and also African actors. And former Ethiopian Minister of State in the Foreign Ministry said that if any African country recognize Somaliland, Ethiopia will be the second one out to do that. But we cannot be the first out of natural reason, he claimed. I don't know if that is still the Ethiopian policy, but it will be interesting to follow. The states of the Horn of Africa is, as I told, in the making. My last point, before I've been given 10 minutes by Øystein to comment, is on then the regional power dynamics created by the Kenyan intervention, which will be more and more interesting as time goes by. You touched upon it, David, that the Kenyans and Ethiopians' agenda in this is on one level the same, try to contain Al-Shabaab, but the long-term solutions are quite different. They do not agree upon, other than to try to pacify the threat of a pan-Somalia force, they don't agree necessarily upon the concrete solutions to the issue. I think what we already see today, and particularly Kenyans' support for Azania or the Jubaland push, and their actors, as you write in your paper, the actors they use on the ground, which are Ogaden linked, clearly raises suspicions in Addis. The Ogaden clan is, if I can say that, the arch enemy of the central government in Ethiopia when it comes to how to handle Ethiopia-Somali relations. So anyone flirting with the Ogadenians are automatically up on Ethiopian radar, and up on Ethiopian radar as a potential enemy and threat against Ethiopian interests. So the closer Kenya gets involved with Ogadenian actors on the ground, the more they will be looked upon with suspicions from the viewpoint of Addis Ababa. And clearly, to understand Somalia today, you need to understand Addis's interest and Addis moves in that regard. This is a concern in itself, but when we then look upon the very fragile relations across the direct Kenyan-Ethiopian borders in Boranaland, where just a year and a half back, you had clashes across the border in Borana territory. The Borana is an Oromo clan living both in Ethiopia and in the northern Kenya. And they disagree on a lot of stuff across that borders. Cattle raiding is a monthly occurrence with a number of people killed, but also territorial claims and support of various resistant movements, you can say, across that field. And adding again to that is then Nairobi and Addis newly established relations with independent South Sudan and their own interest to control what's happening in South Sudan from Addis or from Nairobi. It will also be a contested terrain for the two states. So on both directly their own borders and on both neighboring countries' borders, territories, Ethiopia and Kenya might have different agendas or clashing agendas. How this accumulated effect will evolve in the near mid-term future will be highly interesting to monitor, to follow, because if these two regional hegemons, regional giants, clash politically or, God forbid, militarily, you will have serious regional implications. And I would have loved to also address the Eritrea issue into all of this, since Eritrea is my kind of favorite country, if you believe it or not, in the region. Favorite people, let me say that, not the favorite regime, favorite people. They are also meddling, of course, in it all. But I think we agree on that their meddling might be exaggerated by certain parties for their own advantages. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kjetil. I believe someone will probably ask you about Eritrea later on, so you will have your opportunity to talk about that as well. Now I give the word to Cindy Horst, and I think it's best you use this microphone.
I think I have to be stopped because this is really a very fascinating panel. I really want to thank David for a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot, and I also really want to thank you for your great focus and your the way that you explained how actually displacement and refugee issues and Dadaab are also very important in this. And I think there's a lot of links. Very often it's forgotten that there are these links between refugee issues, humanitarianism, and conflict and political solutions. So I want to thank you for that, and Øystein, of course, for organizing this. I think my task here is to focus on refugee humanitarian issues. Although both speakers touched upon that, I want to say 3 words, a few more, on the protracted refugee situation in Dadaab. Then I want to talk specifically about the concern with mobility and displacement and how that's actually relevant for conflict. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the impact of Al-Shabaab for the humanitarian situation in the region. First of all, yes, the camps have existed for 21 years, Dadaab, but as you saw from the graphs, the situation is actually very different. So we talk about a protracted refugee situation, and UNHCR and others are very concerned with protracted refugee situation, also for security reasons. But at the same time, we have to understand that this is a very, it changes all the time. And I think from 2007, with this real increase in populations, and also with the securitization and militarization of the region, things look very different. On top of that, also the populations that have come in are very different. So you have all kinds of ethnic differences now, with mainly from the inter-riverine areas, a very different group of people that have come to have a slave history, a very different population than the population that was there before. So obviously that has also changed the situation in Dadaab in terms of the dynamics between these different groups. And you pointed out that, yes, there's all these reports on Al-Shabaab being involved in kidnapping, etc., but there's not a lot of certainty on this. We hope to be doing research on refugee militarization in both Dadaab and Dolo Ado, but we'll have to see first whether we get the money and then whether it's actually possible to do the research. But I think at the same time, yes, there's a lot of reports that come out from Dadaab, and also talking to former research assistants, for example, refugees who've been living in the camps for a very long time. Their concern is real. They are very concerned with the situation the security situation in Dadaab. So it's not just the fact that there's a securitization and it's more difficult to move in and out of the camps, which affects livelihoods and it affects humanitarian aid that can be provided, but it's also the actual security situation in Dadaab. So there have been reports that community leaders who are engaged in peace, they have all these kind of communities to deal with peace and stability in the camps. There have been reports that 2 were murdered, there's a lot of threats in the camps, and there's also recruitment of young Somalis. And all of this is very difficult to verify, but at the same time, people who live there have that increasing concern. So obviously that has impacts for the fact that there are refugees who are not receiving protection right across the border when they expect, of course, well, they're supposed to get protection. But hopefully we'll be able to report more on this in a year or so. But secondly, I think more generally, mobility is actually a factor in regional and international foreign policy choices and in conflict. And I think that's also something that needs to be stressed. First of all, regionally, the 750,000 that live in Kenya and Ethiopia, so the border areas, the security issues, the drain on resources, that is very important. But we also shouldn't deny the fact that these displaced populations are very relevant from an international perspective as well. So European concerns and European policies towards Dadaab and towards regional policies are also very much driven by a concern for the large influx of Somalis into Europe, or the perceived large influx of Somalis. So there's a lot of choices that are being made in Europe and in the US that are also driven by that. And again, we hope to be doing more research on looking at these links between humanitarian crisis, displacement, and conflict. But I think what is more important is that on a general level, displacement is often seen as something that's abnormal. So we have to manage it and we have to control it. So a lot of the policies are determined by the sedentary norm, the idea that people live in one place. Protection of civilians, for example, and the right to remain. There's an increasing focus on people's right to remain. So we want to protect people to make sure that they can stay in the place where they are. Having worked with Somalis from 1995, it's a very mobile population, so that region that you're showing here, people move all the time. And they don't, of course there is a place where you're from, but at the same time, mobility is a way of, it's a livelihood strategy. So ideas of, like, this is where you belong and this is where you should stay, of course has a lot to do with our understanding of the nation state. And a lot of the policies and a lot of the choices that are made are also determined by that. And I think it needs a bit of a reconceptualization. So on the one hand, mobility and migration is very common for people. Secondly, also state borders, nation-state borders are crossed and used all the time. So you see a lot of transnational links, flows of people, information, goods, money that impact local situations. And then I just want to quote Oliver Bakewell, who says something really interesting. He says, mobility is normal for the wealthy international elite, but a symptom of development and protection failure among the poor. So we need to reflect on this. I think that's very powerfully put. He talks about development aid, which is called, an article called Keeping Them in Their Place. By Al-Shabaab are difficult to access. It's difficult to see what's happening. there. So there's issues of visibility of what's going on there. But at the same time, we have to recognize that humanitarian aid is not just provided by Western donors. So there's a lot of humanitarian aid that is actually provided in those areas by Al-Shabaab, by Turkey, and other non-traditional donors, and also Somali diaspora contributions. Although they are much more difficult for many different reasons, but our understanding of humanitarian aid, again, we need to enlarge. It's not just the Western contributions that are there. There are many other ways that people receive humanitarian aid. But then secondly, it's not just about what Al-Shabaab does or doesn't do, but it's also about the international response and the heavily politicized war against Al-Shabaab. You really clearly illustrated the regional dynamics of that, and I think Kjetil also pointed out the international dynamics of that. So the anti-terror laws in the US, currently there's a big row in Minneapolis where federal restrictions have led a bank to close down Hawala offices. And Hawala are these they're basically money transfer systems like Western Union that Somali use, and that also international organizations use. But now in Minneapolis, Somalis can't send money anymore. And of course, since this is what is the lifeline for their relatives in these different regions, it's a huge concern for people. And also, interestingly, many international organizations have no other way but to use these Hawala offices, and are increasingly concerned with whether they're then breaking the law and contributing to, or seen to be contributing to Al-Shabaab. So I think it's a real complex work. I think my sum up is that it's quite a complex reality. We should try to look at some of the concepts we use, like the idea that people are supposed to be in one place, and also the idea that international aid is, or humanitarian aid is something that's provided by Western donors, as a way of looking at the situation a bit more broadly. Thank you very much.